Sons of Vulcan, the forefathers of the steel unions of the U.S. The Sons of Vulcan were one of the earliest labor groups in Pittsburgh, and they were leaders in the labor movement throughout the metal industry. They were specialized iron workers, known as puddlers. Puddlers were those workers employed in the process known as puddling. This process allowed mills to use cheaper coal instead of charcoal to produce huge amounts of wrought iron. These men worked in two-man teams for brutal 12-hour shifts, which had a devastating effect on their health. Puddlers had a life expectancy of just 30 years. Theirs was a specialized craft, and they had to sense when the metal was ready to be cooled into bars. Skilled workers were high in demand, and they came up after years as apprentices. Most puddlers in the early U.S. metal industry were immigrants who had worked in the iron industries of the United Kingdom. This privileged position as skilled workers and skilled craftsmen allowed them to negotiate with their bosses better than other workers. As is typical of labor organizing in this time, the craft union mentality meant that workers used their specialized knowledge and skills to advance their own interests in a relatively narrow sense. The first strike of puddlers occurred before the formation of the Sons of Vulcan, in 1849. The strike lasted from December to May, with the puddlers refusing to work until wages improved. However, the strike was a failure. The mills brought in scabs, and when the strike ended, the puddlers resumed work with lowered wages, if at all. This was the beginning of the puddlers' move towards organizing and a union. In April 1858, a few puddlers secretly met in a bar in downtown Pittsburgh. An economic crisis in 1857 had led to plummeting prices of iron, and the majority of mills lay idle throughout much of that year. In this climate of discontent, these skilled workers formed an organization they named the Iron City Forge of the Sons of Vulcan. This naming convention would continue as the Sons of Vulcan expanded, with local chapters being referred to as forges. Membership remained small and secretive due to fear of reprisals from management, like blacklisting. The fortunes of this union soon changed for the better. In 1861, the Civil War broke out, and it had the effect that wars tend to have on labor. Manpower dried up as young men left to fight. The demand for raw materials also increased, and, along with a tariff, the price of iron skyrocketed. In 1862, the Union was officially formed as the United Sons of Vulcan, adopting bylaws and a constitution. The Sons had moved from a local fraternal organization in secret to a national union of puddlers. The union saw great success in increasing the wages of puddlers, due in no small part to collective bargaining and the skyrocketing demand for iron. In 1864, the Sons struck nationwide at the threat of cut wages. The strike ended with success. Employers agreed to a wage scale set to match the price of iron. According to the Quarterly Journal of Economics, this was the first such scale agreement made in U.S. labor history. The Sons of Vulcan did face troubles. Their craft union approach, as well as their racist attitudes, proved to be huge weaknesses. The union had a conservative policy toward strikes and only allowed white members. Only voluntary dues were used to support striking workers, and only workers with a grievance were supposed to strike. This lack of solidarity meant that employers could simply import already puddled iron bars from other mills, whose puddlers were not striking, and process that iron. Because dues for strike support were voluntary, puddlers also weren't well supported by the union during strikes. The result was the collapse of many forges and a drastic decline in membership in 1868. The Sons did learn from their mistakes. They centralized, created permanent paid managerial roles. In addition, strike control was centralized, and strike relief was increased through non-voluntary dues. The Sons' improved tactics and solidarity among puddlers allowed them to rebound. In 1875, they were the largest and strongest union in the country. 1875 would prove pivotal for the Sons of Vulcan. A strike began in December of 1874 and stretched all the way to April, over rates being paid according to that negotiated scale. A crash in the price of wrought iron meant that the puddlers were paid half of what they had been making. In April, a strike was ended, but so too was the scale agreement they had negotiated. Recognizing the limits of their exclusive craft unionism and the need for stronger collective bargaining, members of several iron and steel unions began agitating for a collective metalworkers union. The Sons of Vulcan agreed in 1876 to merge with the Associated Brotherhood of Iron and Steel Heaters, Rollers, and Roughers, as well as the Union of Steel Roll Hands and the United Nailers Union. The new union was called the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, known as the AA. The Sons of Vulcan contributed 85% of union membership to this new union, and the puddlers remained the dominant force in the union for much of the rest of the century. While puddlers had managed to pioneer labor organizing in the metal industry, demand for their craft waned. The price of wrought iron never again reached the levels it did during the Civil War. The Bessemer process being introduced to America caused steel production to no longer involve puddlers. Although the wrought iron was preferred to steel for construction for a few decades, eventually advances in the quality of steel caused a rapid decline in the demand for wrought iron. As their trade faded, so too did the influence of puddlers in the AA. When the Homestead strike ended in disaster for the AA, the influence of puddlers and their union was almost non-existent. There was one final gasp for the Sons of Vulcan, however. In 1910, fed up with a perceived lack of support from the AA, a group of Pittsburgh puddlers voted to create a new Sons of Vulcan. Their vote reflected an attempted return to craft unionism, which they hoped would allow them to better advocate for themselves. A successful strike in 1910, supported by the AA, led to favorable negotiation of scale for the puddlers. However, in the following years, the new Sons turned their backs on the AA, allowing members to work in otherwise non-union shops and work alongside scabs. When the Sons tried striking again in 1917 without support from the AA, their union collapsed. A mere 2 years later, the 1919 steel strike would see the AA essentially defeated as well. The legacy of the Sons of Vulcan can be seen today. When the United Steelworkers were formed in 1942, they based some of their constitution on that of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, which itself was closely adapted from the original constitution of the Sons of Vulcan. The USW can draw a direct line from itself to the original Sons of Vulcan, from a century and a half ago. Although there are no puddlers left today, the USW continues to advocate for workers in Pittsburgh. In September, contract workers from Google Pittsburgh voted to form a union and join the USW. In a chronically underorganized field, the USW draws on the legacy of the Sons of Vulcan to further the rights of workers.